Okay, so we'll make a start. And I just wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the unceded lands, skies, and waters on which we come together virtually today. So I'm on campus at Deakin's Burwood campus, and that is Wurundjeri country. So we pay our deep respect to the ancestors and elders of all the lands on which you may be joining us from. Okay, so today's research seminar is a bit different to the topics that we usually have. And this is also welcome Alex, our department head, Professor Alex Newman. This was his big push to really enhance our capabilities in social media. So, so thank you. And
thank you, Ian, for joining us today. It's very much appreciated. I have to buzz off at 10:45. So if I don't get any chance to answer questions, I might leave a few in the chat. So
yeah.
thank you.
We'll give you first right of questions then, Alex, if there's time for questions before you go. So, so yeah, as you know, we've invited this world-leading expert to give us some advice on why it's important for academics to use social media and what we should be doing on social media. So we're very pleased to welcome Professor Ian Mccarthy to our seminar series. And just to say a few words to introduce Ian. Ian is the W.J. Van Dusen, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Professor of Innovation and Operations Management at the Beatty School of Business at Simon Fraser University, which I noted is a partner institution to Deakin Business School. Ian's research on operations management and change and innovation management has appeared in journals including Academy of Management Review, Journal of Product Innovation Management, and California Management Review, among others. And in addition to that research, he's also published highly cited and award-winning research on the topic of social media. So one of his papers has actually been the most highly Google Scholar cited paper across all business management and economics journals. And I think what's more impressive is that he actually walks the talk. So he has a huge Twitter following. I'm one of his Twitter followers. He's been named by Business Insider magazine on a list of smart thinkers that everyone should follow, alongside the likes of Richard Branson and Ariana Huffington. So this is all very impressive. I'm very keen to learn about your latest research on this topic, Ian, and thank you for being here. Yeah, over to you if you want to share your slides. Do you have slides to share?
Do. Hopefully you can see those slides.
Yeah.
It's a lovely introduction. I've never been to Australia. This is the first talk I've given to an Australian university via technology, and I've never met Lee. We probably know each other reasonably well online in terms of following each other. I follow her updates and what she does, and so that's central to this talk in terms of how social media is really a boundary spanning technology. It allows us to connect and find resources and views and perspectives that maybe we wouldn't find otherwise, and to do it quite efficiently and well. This is based on a paper which just came out. So when Lee asked me if I'd be willing to talk about this, I said, well, I'm actually in the process of writing a paper that should hopefully be accepted by the time the date comes around. And it came out on the 12th of May, and it's with Marcel Bojes, who's at the Technical University of Eindhoven. Marcel and I met on Twitter many, many years ago. We've done lots of work since there, run conferences, special issues, published together, many things in terms of, and we met via Twitter, and we're both open innovation scholars. And so open innovation is central to a lot of the logic and rationales for this particular talk. This talk is not a traditional research seminar. The paper is not a traditional research paper. It's more of a pragmatic guide, a call to action. It does draw upon research and personal experiences of myself and Marcel in terms of using social media. So just some questions to sort of frame this talk. try and think back to when you first became a business academic, maybe when you did your PhD, or how you became a business academic. What was your motivation? Why did you become a business academic? And why business? Why an academic? And when you think about an answer to that, it might be because you wanted to study and understand business and management. You wanted to learn. You wanted to study interesting things about it. And maybe even with that understanding, you wanted to use that to help business and management be better. Maybe. And I put maybe there in terms of doing things, because if you think about what motivates you now, what drives you, what keeps you awake at weekends, what keeps you working late at night in terms of doing things, what worries you when it comes to tenure and promotion in terms of doing things. For many people, it's about how to get into top tier management journals. And this is an issue which is not necessarily in conflict with the two goals above, but it seems to be dominating it. And people, when I say people, I mean people in these organizations, RRBM, DORA, HIBAR, these are associations around the world who are sort of saying, we're very obsessed with theory. We're very obsessed with, getting into top tier management journals. We have a crisis of relevance. We have a crisis of integrity. We rarely replicate any of our studies. They're usually one sweet paper with one sweet contribution, and we rarely sort of make data available. Lots of p-hacking going on, and lots of other sort of forms of marginal and clear misconduct going on. And the custodians of these organizations, and RRBM, which one I know very well, it's set up and led by some of the most respected and leading management scholars in the world, and they're concerned, and they want us to sort of rethink our mission and what we do. And you also look at how much it costs to produce a paper in a top tier journal. So imagine it takes 5 years. That's a reasonable estimate from idea to finish. Revise and resubmits at one top tier journal, revise and resubmits at another top tier journal, and after 5 years you get in. Imagine how much time and money you have spent on that one piece of paper, that one article. And back in 2014, some researchers at Wharton University conservatively estimated it cost about $400,000 for a top tier paper. That's conservatively. And then people also question, what would happen to society if all the knowledge in top tier management journals in the last 40, 50 years just suddenly magically disappeared? We removed all that knowledge and that research. How would the world change? How would it be worse? How would it be better? What would change in terms of doing things? And the people who are asking this are the people who pay, business professors to write $400,000 papers, which is taxpayers, governments, research funding, councils, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the sort of context for this in terms of, and so the aim of the paper and the aim of the talk is really just to emphasize that when you look at social media technologies, they're sort of boundary spanning technologies which allow us to go beyond our fields, go beyond our industry, and maybe do engaged, impactful scholarship. And I'll talk more about that. And really, they're technologies that they're just they're one particular tool which help us address the founding principle of RRBM, which is the development of knowledge which benefits a business and broader society. And so I'm going to go through, I'm going to talk about how I use social media, how others use social media, what research says is good practice and decent practice about using social media, the dark side of using social media. Talk about different approaches, and those approaches really vary in terms of how active you are or passive you are in actually using social media, and to what extent you want to pursue openness and engage scholarship. And so that's the background. A little bit of an introduction. What is social media? Most of you will know what social media is, but they're technologies which allow us to share content online, share, co-create, discuss content. So when you share pictures, videos, text messages on your phone, you're doing it on nearly always on platforms which are social media platforms. And so this is the user-generated content. It can be text, it can be audio, it can be video, it can be image. And social media companies, their functionality, their business models are based on the extent to which you share and reveal your presence, have conversations with each other, the extent to which you know who you have in common in terms of your network, whether you have groups, whether there's some sort of reputational ranking. And that functionality of social media and the different platforms and the different shading of the honeycombs sort of indicate how different platforms place different emphasis on different functionality of social media. And so we use this, in personal life, in media, but we can also use it not just for dissemination, not just for promoting our papers, but for other areas of the research process, which I'll go through. I won't talk too much about the mainstream platforms, but we have blogs, we have podcasts, we have the Facebooks, the Twitters, the YouTubes, the LinkedIns. These are all different ways of sharing, discussing, modifying content. And it can be text-based, as I said, video-based, audio-based in terms of going forward. What's quite interesting is the rise of academic-orientated social media, preprint servers for putting papers which are in press, work in progress, and you want to share them, scholarly collaboration networks, so people didn't think that academia.edu or ResearchGate would survive for IP reasons and legal reasons, but they have, and they are. And they're not just repositories for sharing papers. You can set up forums for discussing your work. You can seek out collaborations. You can seek out partnerships. So they're more than just preprint servers. They're what we call scholarly collaboration networks. Then we have academic-oriented news platforms, so magazines or newspapers online, which are run by academics for academics. And the people who are writing articles and creating content are academics commenting on their research or sharing their research in connection to events going on in life. And lastly, we have all of these sort of identity impact tools, and these are quite important, particularly ORCID and DOIs, digital object identifiers. Many of you will have Google Scholar profiles, and that once you set up a Google Scholar profile, Google sort of tracks your publications and adds them to your profile automatically. Sometimes it makes mistakes and it adds papers that have nothing to do with you by somebody who shares a similar name. Well, things like ORCID, and ORCID is the O in ORCID stands for open, and the R for research, C for contributor, and the ID for identification. These are sort of permanent, non-disappearing sort of identifiers which you have and you put with your work and your contributions. And these are central for, particularly for dissemination and assessment, which I'll talk about. So why use social media? Well, building on the questions about relevance and crisis of relevance, we were motivated by the work of two very influential scholars, Andrew van der Ven, who passed away recently, who created the seminal book on engaged scholarship. And the thesis of the book is basically, you're going to do more impactful research if you go beyond your boundaries to choose better questions, to choose better resources and better ways of addressing those questions. So you're involving people who experience the issues and not just working with and collaborating with people who study the issues. How many of us study the issues but never really experience them? And so engaged scholarship is about enriching the whole research process by connecting with and involving stakeholders, often non-academics, who are actually experiencing the issues that you're studying. And Andrew Hoffman, in his role, he sort of doesn't regard and call himself a public sort of academic. He's built on Andrew van der Ven's work and talks about engaged scholarship sort of in the modern era, in the social media era, in fact. Marcel and I are open innovation scholars. We publish on open innovation. When you look at what open innovation is about how firms learn outside of their domains and outside of their boundaries, how you go and find other sources of information and knowledge which are important. And when you look at open innovation and you look at innovations in different industries, it's remarkable how many of the major sort of defining industries involve learning beyond your sector and learning beyond your domain. And then finally, as Lee mentioned, I've done work on social media, and the social media honeycomb was in this paper. And so I've been a sort of a practitioner of what I advocated in that paper and what I've studied since, and so been a user of social media. So we argue that if you use social media, you can avoid some of the pitfalls of closeness. You know, academics are, universities are described as ivory towers, and the ivory tower metaphor means that we're protected, we're segregated, we have the freedom to study and to explore. But with that sort of separation and disconnection, sometimes you miss things, you know, and so we're not saying that you shouldn't avoid being closed. We're arguing that you can use social media to complement some of the benefits of closeness. So we're not arguing that we shouldn't be trained and rewarded by academics in our field to develop and publish research in journals in our field, to impact academics in our field. But I'm saying that's what we shouldn't just do that. You know, in terms of doing things. If we just do that, then we're producing $400,000 papers just for academics in our fields. So it's about leveraging insights and expertise from different stakeholders, and certainly not sacrificing rigor for relevance. And again, as an innovation scholar, when you look at the type of innovation, we're looking at use-inspired research. That top right hand, it's not about doing consultancy, it's not about doing, you know, highly applied consultancy. It's doing fundamental research, which is valuable to some aspect of society. And it doesn't mean that all research is going to be this. It's like a portfolio approach. And the arguments from those organizations that I put up, RRBM and DORA, it's saying that we've just shifted so much to the focusing on just getting into top tier journals. And, you know, when Lee was, you know, talking about my profile, she described me as somebody who got into journals. I got into AMR, I got into California Management Review. You know, that's how we do it. That's how my bios, they're probably old bios, which say that, you know, in terms of doing things. We describe each other by what we got into rather than what we did and the impact of what we did. So when you look at a lot of the sort of work on advising and researching why and how academics should use social media, a lot of it focuses on dissemination. And we argue that it's not just dissemination. And if you look at, you know, some of the major stages in research, from networking and framing and selecting ideas to actually doing the research, then the dissemination, and then assessing the impact of your research, you could use social media at all of those stages. And probably the two dominant ones are disseminating, next followed by networking, but the others are some distance behind in terms of how we use social media as part of that research process. So why use social media for networking? How to use social media for networking? Well, you know, we know that networking is important to academic life. You know, we know that, and life in general. But we also know that social media business models are actually built on networking. They're built on networks, you know, that's how they exist. That's their business model in terms of connecting and linking and connecting people. So they're very powerful. They're very powerful technologies for understanding and harnessing and capturing value from your network. And by value, I mean knowledge and connections and resources. And imagine, you know, if you're trying to do those activities using social media, but you have no network. Okay, you have a Facebook account, you have a Twitter account, you have a LinkedIn account, but you don't follow no one and no one follows you. You know, you're not going to be very influential in terms of doing any of the other stages if you don't have any network. And very few people have no network, but some people have very low networks. And then when they shift, they find that they can't build on the other activities. When you look at those 5 activities, they look sequential, and they are sequential in nature. But we know that we start and move around from different activities as research projects evolve. You go to networking, frameworking, back to networking. When you're doing investigating, you might go back to your networks again. It's not as sequential as it's shown. They're just 5 fundamental activities which can benefit and utilize social media technologies. So networks are central to boundary spanning, and they are central to sort of getting new information, maybe information which is more digestible, maybe rethink why something matters, and understand how it is. Now I'm going to show a little sort of summary. In the paper, I sort of use as an illustrative example all the way through how social media was used in 2 research articles on how to measure and deal with workplace bullshit. And so I'm going to talk about the networks and the framing and the assessing and the dissemination, mostly in regard to that paper. And so this was a paper where, once I discovered that I really was quite interested in writing a paper on bullshit, given the times we were in, and I wanted to explain to managers the sort of pitfalls of bullshit. I've never met any of these scholars, but again, I've connected with them heavily, not just through their work, academic work, but through conversations. I see what they say about bullshit and the study of bullshit and what it means, and and various ideas and theories and techniques from studying it. And then from those individuals, then I'm sort of connected to journalists and business leaders who are one, famous for actually producing it, or 2, advocate and try to sort of combat the amount of bullshit in life. Lucy Kellaway is a journalist at the Financial Times, and she often writes about, how much bullshit there is in society and workplace, and so does Scott Burkon, and in terms of doing things. And Elon Musk is on, he's both a producer of it, but he also stifles it within his organization, and is a hater of jargon and acronyms and everything else. And so you're learning, from not just an academic perspective, but a sort of a reality perspective. And I'm bringing my own perceptions and my own concerns about workplace in society. Some of the most interesting work I discovered was in terms of psychologists who do experiments, and they try to understand whether you can bullshit a bullshitter, and what makes some people receptive to bullshit and what makes other people receptive to bullshit. And it's beautiful work that I would never have come across if I just focused on the management researchers. And it was very influential. And then similarly, in terms of the sort of information science domain, in the world of, misinformation, disinformation, leaders around the world, who, seem to be guilty of this particular act of communication. Again, all sorts of insights. And so you can see how, and again, this is not just papers. I get their papers, but I'm hearing and following their conversations, often very public conversations, often joining them and even reaching out to them and talking to them in terms of understanding how to frame what I'm going to work on. What are we going to do, and what's going to be useful for management scholars and management practitioners. And it's a process of filtering, combining, and sense making. And the last bullet point is from the editor of the journal Business Horizons, and he wrote a piece recently talking about how really impactful research rarely comes from gaps in the research literature, rarely. But from conversing with people in reality, practicing managers, scrutinizing what journalists are saying, scrutinizing what entrepreneurs are feeling. It's dealing with real people, and then going back to the literature and understanding, looking for big problems. And we've heard this for years. This is not just new, but Andrew van der Ven, Andy Hoffman, and others, in terms of engaged scholars, really set us along this train. And all we argue in this paper is that social media is a tool or a technology to help us do this. Co-author on the paper, Marcel Boges. So this is talking about framing, where he networks outside of his field and starts dealing with sort of economics strategy professor Nikolai Voss, and all of this information is public. You can see these conversations, and you can see the conversation that they had about a conference and about potentially working together and joining their one's area of expertise in open innovation, another one in terms of micro foundations. And then they can sort of track how that led to a conference paper, and then how that led to a research paper. But it's networking, it's framing, and it's within academia, but it's beyond the field of innovation and moving into economics and strategy. But similarly, this happens in terms of outside of academia. This is an email that one of the co-authors of the work that I did on bullshit, Caitlin, this is an email from a very senior executive of a US company, employs 200,000 people. And he said, just finished reading your article on the organizational bullshit perception scale. I loved it. I'm an industrial psychologist. I'd love to chat about how to use it. And so imagine when we start chatting with somebody who is running surveys and running, this for the organization, and we're understanding the value he sees in this particular tool and technology, and how it links to employee engagement, how it links to concerns about how maybe marketing is riddled with bullshit and accounting doesn't have enough of it in terms of doing things. And and it helps us to frame and understand and set off on a new program of research, because we're not just talking with other academics, we're talking with people outside of our domain. In terms of investigating, social media platforms are sources of information, global real-time information about how people are feeling, how people are behaving. Many of the major platforms provide special functional tools for researchers. You ask for permission, you prove that you're a researcher, you prove that you will use the data in respectful, ethical ways, and they will give you access to the data at no cost, often with technical support. And even if you don't use those particular functional offerings that come or are provided by social media platforms, you can just use social media as well for prototyping and testing. And again, the work I've done on bullshit, we used it for pre-testing a scale, meeting with people afterwards in terms of following out. It's a very, very successful way of actually sort of engaging with, in this case, data collection, and then the focus groups that we had around scale development and the definitions of workplace bullshit and the issues being faced. Another example here with Marcel in terms of how he's used it to investigate, do research on how open innovation is taught in classrooms around the world, not just in business, but completely outside of his network, and working with Jonathan Sims at Babson. And even for this particular talk and the paper behind this talk, I wanted to hear from people about what they thought were the dark sides or the risks of using social media. And one of the biggest eye-opening things here was, when I look at the risks, and I'll talk about the dark side at the end, I was really made aware, much more aware than I realized, about how the risks when things go wrong are much more damaging depending on your gender and your race in terms of doing things, particularly when it comes to dissemination. And so that became very apparent. And if you look at that tweet and you look at the conversations and you look at the sharing in terms of doing things, that took me down all sorts of rabbit holes in terms of actually looking for research-based evidence, on the issues that were being raised, and it was, very, very enlightening. So disseminating, I think it's important to clarify the difference between dissemination, attention, and impact. So dissemination is what we do. This is dissemination. I am disseminating, and this is resulting in some attention. Some of you are interested and attentive, and some of you are not. Some of you are multitasking and less interested and less attentive, and that's just the way it is in terms of doing things. But dissemination is what we do to share and spread our research online. And attention is the extent to what we share is sort of consumed, liked, reshared, discussed. And from that intention can come impact. And impact is the extent to which the research is cited, used, and maybe used to change how people think and act. And that's the key thing, and that's probably the most difficult thing to measure. When you look at, dissemination, I tend to think about it in two stages. There's the acceptance stage of a piece of research. You tend to update and let people know it's part celebration, part notification. I produce preprints of the papers. I put them into scholarly collaborative networks. I put them into paper depositories. But then when the digital object identifier comes out, then I change what I do and how I do it. And it's all around making sure that all the content that I'm using when it comes to dissemination has a DOI in it. And so the paper has a DOI. I tend to produce slides, which I've done. So this paper came out 2 weeks. This is the first set of slides. They're embedded with a DOI. They'll go on to SlideShare. They'll go on to my blog. They'll go on to my paper depositories. And they'll all have DOIs on it. And the reason why DOIs is important is because you can use tools to then track who is using your work and who's resharing your work and get an assessment of impact. And then once I have the DOIs again and the slides are produced, then it usually talks and interviews. So I did the slides, I'm doing a talk now. I may, do a video recording of this. I'll look at the video recording that, is produced by Deakin. If I like it, I might ask if I can use it. If I don't like it, I'll do my own video recording of it and I'll post it on my YouTube channel, on my blog, share it on LinkedIn and share it on Twitter. And all the time, it always has a DOI on it. So it's always connected to the, to the paper. This was the first video I ever produced back in 2012, maybe. It's been viewed a couple of 100,000 times.
Details about themselves. In others, they want to remain complete.
And so I won't show the whole video, but it was a video that we did with a researcher who we hired, a research student we hired. Really pleased with it. A lot of effort, a lot of learning curves involved. And it was really fundamental in sort of sharing that paper and getting it out and helping people to understand how to understand the functional building blocks of social media. Since then, I don't produce videos for all my papers, but there are companies that produce them and they will charge you several $1,000s to produce a short animated explainer video of your paper. But now there are even sort of platforms, one's called Powtoon. So the last video I produced, the one for the bullshit paper, the video was produced by my teenage son. And so I gave it to him as a summer project. I said, look, learn this platform and, and do it as a project. And I gave him some pocket money over the summer to do this. And, and the technology's out there. I do podcasts, I'm regularly sort of sharing my work on all of the platforms, but always with DOIs and always connecting and trying to understand the connections because I'm interested in impact. I'm interested in the impact. What's interesting is it's not just you who disseminates your work, but others take your work and disseminate it. And so this is something that was done with Marcel's opinion piece in Nature, where he was writing about principles for social media for scientists, and someone produces infographic, and that happens. And in the same way as when you go right back to, someone else produced the infographic on the right, they take they take the social media honeycomb and they've used it, and you see it being used, and you see it being used to understand how social media exists and why it's important. And different people are taking your knowledge and using it and combining it in ways. And you can track that in terms of going, particularly if it's associated with a DOI. Again, the paper I'm talking about now, this talk, again, when people share it online, this is someone on LinkedIn, you get to see what they say about the paper, what they like, what was the favorite hidden gem in the actual paper. This is all can be tracked and you can understand it, you can use it. What can you use it for? Framing future research. You can use it for, how you investigate future research, and also for getting a sense of impact. the extent to which you do dissemination or any of the things that we suggest in our paper also depends on your institution. This is Marcel in 2019. His institution actually has an award for dissemination. So, you know, how good are you at dissemination? And in 2019, when he was at the University of Copenhagen, he won the Faculty of Science Dissemination Award for his use of social media. But many institutions don't care about it. Many institutions may even criticize you for doing it. And so, so it depends on your institutional fit in terms of which of the approaches you might use for social media. This is an interesting diagram from Autometric. It shows a sort of timeline in terms of, you know, how attention spreads, first using tweets or LinkedIn posts or Facebook posts, how they may then trigger into news outlets, articles or information discussions, and then people start to bookmark it and share it on other networks, and people read and comment and blog about it. Eventually it trickles down into policy documents, reference documents, including Wikipedia. The good thing about Altmetric, which I'm going to talk about, is it will track DOIs in everything from social media to regular media, to patents, to course syllabi. Is it being used in course syllabi, and is your stuff being taught in terms of policy documents? And so it's pretty impressive in terms of understanding, you know, to what extent your work is getting attention. The key thing to keep in mind is that attention does not mean quality. Some areas of work are noisier and more trendy than others. So my work on bullshit, you know, it was quite noisy, it was quite topical, the timing was right, and people were quite interested in it, not just because of the word bullshit, but because of the issues we were dealing with at the time. When it comes to assessing, you're tracking what's out there online. It's not just papers, journal articles, or DOIs, it's data sets, clinical trials, book chapters, white papers, blogs. It must have some sort of identifier. And for most of us, and by us I mean business school academics, it will be DOIs in the papers that we have. And so that's why it's important that when you're sharing or doing media interviews, or your university is writing a piece about your work and they link to it, make sure they link to it using the DOI link in terms of doing things, because that's what is important. And so, as I say, you know, Plumx, Altmetric, other platforms, social media platforms, they will track, you know, the attention your work is getting from everything from patents to syllabi to policies to blogs to Wikipedia. And I'll just give some examples. So if you look at the paper, the illustrative example, the paper on bullshit, and this is a screenshot using, you know, my Chrome browser, and I visited it, you can see. And so I have a plugin, it's called an Altmetric plugin up there. And what I do is when I go to this web page, I just click on that Altmetric plugin and it recognizes the DOI, which is the same DOI at the bottom. And then it automatically produces this attention score. And I get to see this attention score for my work. And the thing at the top is called an Altmetric donut. And it's made up of different colors. And the different colors represent the different potential outlets that your work is getting attention in. And you'll see there like 15 news outlets, 2 blogs, 1,000 tweets, 4 Wikipedia pages, 18 Scopus citations, 122 Mendeley accounts. And just you'll see that information. It also tells you, if you look at the top up here, it tells you that ever since Altmetric has been running, it has, and Altmetric is tracking about 38 million different articles currently, and that goes up about 2 million every year, or 3 or 4 million every year. But 21 million of those 38 million actually have some sort of attention score, so that we know that not all articles get attention. And it tells me, you know, how this paper ranks out of 21 million. It also tells me if I look at articles out of that 21 million of a similar age. And when I say 21 million, that's 21 million articles in science, engineering, healthcare, all disciplines. It also tells me how well this article is featuring in terms of attention for the journal. And so again, when you look at those numbers there, it says, you know, Business Horizon has 838 outputs. Well, it has more than 838 outputs, but it has 838 outputs that have any sort of altmetric attention. And it has 18 in recent years, or in the last 2 years, which have altmetric attention. So only about 40% of articles receive, only about 60% of articles receive altmetric attention. It's important to recognize that altmetric attention, while it can be some sort of proxy to quality, it's not necessarily, it doesn't strictly equate to quality. Again, you know, you could be doing something which is highly controversial, highly topical, and you know, it gets a lot of attention on its own in terms of going forward. And this should complement, you know, other ways of measuring academic impact. Just one example is that, you know, it's not just media, as I said, like it's news reports. This is a paper that Marcel and I did on open innovation. It features in a EU publication on how to support small to medium-sized businesses in Europe in terms of IP protocols for open innovation. You can also look, this is one of my papers, the original social media paper I wrote. So far, it's been cited in 3 patents. And you can see how that work is used in 3 patents. And so, again, these are all sort of somewhat indicators of impact in terms of going forward. But what's interesting with social media is you also get to gauge impact in terms of people sending messages on social media saying, Ian, I loved your paper. I now give it out at every meeting, or we give it to every new employee, or I print this out and put it on my board and stuff. And you get these messages that people just share. And I just keep a collection of these and file them away in terms of people using, claiming to use the work in their workplace and you know, and sharing the knowledge within the paper. And again, another example, this is another company in the US, 12,000 employees. And again, they're saying, look, you know, we want to use your work, and this is how we'd like to use it. Can you help us use it? And these are all assessments of impact. And again, they might use our work, and it might turn out to make them worse off, or you know, and it might have a negative impact. So it's really hard to measure actual positive impact, but you can see how social media provides a technology to do that. Just to finish off with, when you look at the different approaches to using social media you can have, we argue that it can range in terms of how active or passive you are in terms of using social media, and also to what extent you really are interested in pursuing openness and engagement. And when you look at that, you know, we say that, you know, there are people who are observers, they're on social media, but they're just monitoring, they're just watching, they're sort of wallflowers. Then there are people who are very passionate in terms of connecting and networking, and they do it for whatever reasons suit their personal agenda. Then there are people who you know, like to promote themselves, their research, their institutions, and they, you know, and it's sort of broadcasting. And then there are people who actually try to influence. And you know, probably one of the things that differentiates an influencer from a promoter is the extent to which they listen and change their behavior in terms of the feedback they receive, rather than just automatically promoting. And these are not mutually exclusive. You know, in a year, I will sometimes do hardcore promoting, sometimes connecting, sometimes influencing. You know, you switch between these. The extent to which you do these will depend on your personality. It will depend on your career stage. It will depend on, you know, how well supported you are by your institution, how familiar you are with using social media technology. In the paper, we outline a whole list of do's and don'ts for each of the roles. Most of them talk about, you know, try not to be robots, try not to be machines and doing it. Remember the social aspect of it. Do consider your timing. Have a reason for doing it. Have a strategy for doing it. In terms of the don'ts, the key don'ts are, you know, don't forget, you know, or don't share and like if you can't explain why you shared and like things, because often you can go through liking things and then you end up liking something that you might regret liking because it was an opinion piece by a professor or a leader or somebody you know, and then you realize that you didn't really read it, you don't know why you like it, and it comes back. Don't expect networks to build themselves, they take time. All of this takes time, I'll talk about that in a bit. Don't replace human engagement with robot-like automated interactions. Sometimes I feel that I become bot-like in terms of my promotion when I'm in certain promotion modes, and I have to scale back. I think it's important in terms of how you communicate and share your research, not to make it so simple that you neglect rigor and integrity, and you're just trying to sensationalize and exaggerate your work. The last point, don't drink and post. You can use social media for dissemination and promoting your work almost any time, any place. And so you might regret doing something on a Saturday night, having had a nice night out, and when you wake up in the morning, in terms of how it's worded and how it's framed in terms of your public presence. In terms of the influencer, don't be tricked into thinking you know more than you do. This is not a case of just going around educating people. As we know from research on persuasion and influencing, the best persuaders, the best influencers are also the best listeners and learners, and in terms of adjusting and framing their arguments to achieve influence. And so this is all covered in the papers. I won't go through it in too much detail. In terms of the dark side, this is it's a big issue. I have one slide on it. The time drain, it takes time. It takes time to do this. And, for me, I find it rewarding. I find it a little bit addictive. It replaces other forms of procrastination for me. And so, I don't watch cat videos. I don't watch dog videos. I do this instead in terms of sharing, looking, learning, disseminating. And so it is a time drain, but like any sort of, in terms of balancing teaching and research and other forms of engagement, it just requires, goal-directed time management. And many of the social media platforms, they will tell you, you can set caps, you can see how much time you spend on social media, and you can, set limits to that. In terms of academic narcissism, there's long been established this thing called the Kardashian Index, named after the celebrity Kardashian. And it's basically saying, the K index looks at your academic profile versus your social media profile and tries to see, how much of an unbalance there is in terms of doing things. So, what is the quality and impact of your academic publications versus the quality and impact of your social media engagements and activities? And are you somebody who's just a celebrity because you're very prolific on social media, but when it comes to looking at your academic contributions, their rigor, their quality and interest, there could be a gap there. And it's a tongue-in-cheek index, but it's a very interesting index in terms of comparing different levels of visibility. Don't forget that social media can increase the impact of mediocre and highly flawed research if you're just focusing on dissemination. We'd hope that if you use social media at all stages all the way through, the questions, the framing, the investigation would help. Be wary of humble bragging and human peacocking. We report in the paper that humble bragging, people have studied humble bragging versus normal bragging. Humble bragging is when you say, oh, I'm so annoyed to be winning this fifth best paper prize, and I have to go to another award ceremony in terms of doing. Humble bragging is perceived to be much more disingenuous than normal bragging. So if you're going to brag, just brag. Don't humble brag. And research, as I said, in terms of collecting things, when you look at the backlash against humble braggings or how people perceive humble bragging, if humble bragging is done by females versus males, it's much more damaging for females in terms of posting, in terms of the studies which have looked at human peacocking and humble bragging in terms of engagement of social media. In terms of trolling and bullying, if you're doing work, particularly in issues to do with identity, gender, climate change, you're going to be, facing potential backlashes and trolling and bullying. And there's lots of good guidelines that universities are now starting to produce about how you don't engage, but you record, you share what's happened, and you report it within your own organization in terms of doing things. It can be, if you're dealing with very, very sort of topical issues, which such as climate change and gender and race and gun crime and other issues like this, you will be exposed to this. It comes with the territory, and there are guidelines now about about how to track and record this and keep records of it. And again, Andy Hoffman, who does the work on engaged scholarship, he's passionate about sustainability and climate change, and a lot of his advice about how to actually deal with and record and mitigate the risks. And finally, the mission reward alignment. To what extent does your institution or your academic field really value openness and impact? And if it doesn't, then this is going to be difficult for you to actually pursue. But if it does, and it gives rewards for dissemination and rewards for engaged scholarship and rewards for making a difference, then social media is likely to be a tool that can help. So just to summarize, social media are boundary spanning technologies that help us to be more open at networking, framing, investigating, and disseminating and assessing our research. I would say it should complement the existing and traditional elements of closed research that are very vital for being rigorous. And ultimately, this is a tool and a technology, a pragmatic guide to help researchers and their research be more engaged and impactful. And myself and Marcel are very open to hearing from you, connecting with you, sharing more information, learning from you about what you liked and didn't like about the paper and the presentation. Thank you.
Wow, fabulous. Thank you so much, Ian. There's so much information here. It's really great to have you take us through each of those steps or ways that that we can use social medias. Yeah, I think probably most of us, I can say definitely myself, underutilizing social media because I didn't actually realize all the ways that we can be using it. So thank you for that. We have about 5 minutes for questions. And we have a question that Alex has popped in the chat before he had to dash off. If anyone else has questions, if you want to put your hand up or just speak up, but perhaps we'll turn to Alex's question first in the chat box, if you don't mind, Ian.
The main differences between Twitter and LinkedIn, I'd say LinkedIn is much more professional in terms of tone, in terms of people who you follow with. It's much more controlled in terms of who you connected with. Twitter is much more open, and so generally most people allow anyone to follow anyone on Twitter, although you can put limits on it. Twitter is also it's sort of micro, 140 character sort of posts, and so you're quite limited. You have to really condense and link and maybe build multiple posts. And so I would say, my two favorite platforms are Twitter and LinkedIn, and they're the ones I engage with most. But Twitter is, has a lot more junk, and it's very influential, but it has a lot more junk, and it has a lot more bots and a lot more fake accounts. When I looked at my LinkedIn network, I would say, easily 90%, but maybe 99% of it is real people, real connections, and not necessarily active. They could be passive observers, but it's going to be, they're going to be very real and much more engaged. But it's a smaller network.
Great, thank you. Lucy has her hand up, and then John.
Thank you so much. That was really fabulous in condensing all of the breadth of the issues. I don't think now's the time, but I think there's a wonderful scholar at Montreal University who's talked about oligopolies in publishing. And so I'm just wondering about your views on what I call the digital octopus that is sort of really affecting all of us, and you know, how we can keep our sanity and be strategic. And I'm asking a question really about the strategy, because as a journal editor, we've developed a social media strategy of posting videos as well as article overviews, because a lot of them are not open access, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm just hoping you might say a little bit about how do you deal with the walls, as it were. How do you get around that in terms of influencing the so-called real people who can then ensure the impact of the papers that are not accessible to them, generally speaking?
So that's a great point. So this is a paper on how to be an open academic, and yet it's behind a paywall. And Sylvia said to me, did I want to spend $3,000 US to make it gold open? And Marcel was going, yes, Ian, we should do that. So I said, Marcel, okay, do you have $3,000 US? And he said, no, I don't, you know. And I said, well, I'm reluctant to make Sylvia even richer than it is already in terms of doing things. And so I asked the journal editors, who are very sympathetic, but this is you know, the journal editors weren't able to help, they were sympathetic. And so I just said to Marcel, our primary audience with the original paper is academics. So this is a paper we're trying to change the profession of academics, you know, so hopefully most academics will have it. But still, we will have preprint versions, and most times we share. And there are many people who are asking, who are not academics, they're quite interested. They're science writers and policy writers, and people in Germany, they can't, because the German government is at dispute with Sylvia. So we try our best to make preprint versions available, when every little bit of dissemination, or we go around saying, oh, this, you know, if you can't, I often say, if you can't access the paper, let me know, and I will share an alternative open access version. And so it's, you know, I'm hoping it will change going forward. I'm hoping, you know, that we won't work for nothing, and then our universities will pay lots of money and governments to access our own work. I see John has his hand up.
Yeah, maybe if you don't mind, Ian, to stop sharing your screen, and then we can see everyone's faces.
That's very good.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. It's a really entertaining presentation. I really enjoyed it. I've got a pretty big LinkedIn network, around 500 people or so, and I'm just wondering, what's the best strategic use of LinkedIn network?
Depends on your personal goals in terms of doing things. So you look at those different stages. You know, do you want to reach out to people? Do you want to disseminate and broadcast? Do you want to learn from people in terms of doing things? I would say that, you know, when you look at the network, I don't know if you're a member of any groups within LinkedIn. So like, you know, like,
Yeah.
and so I find the groups are fairly influential in terms of the conversations that would go on. But I use LinkedIn for, you know, disseminating. I use LinkedIn for seeking advice, seeking collaborators. You know, LinkedIn and Twitter are my two favorite platforms. Facebook, I tend to keep for personal use, but I will join groups. Reddit, I'm really interested in the discussions which happen in Reddit, but I just don't like the interface of Reddit. It feels like you need, it's not as user friendly. It's more geeky and nerdy, but it has very, very interesting conversations in terms of going forward. But you know, you use LinkedIn to, you know, to share and collect, you know, and it's like, you know, and you think, you know, and you can see who likes, and you can follow up, and you can connect. But you can also, you know, I don't know if you can search within LinkedIn. You can, like, so for example, you know, you can, so if your topic of work is bullshit, I can type in bullshit and other keywords like Harry Frankfurt, who's the Princeton philosopher, doing it, and I can see within LinkedIn all the conversations going on with Harry Frankfurt, and his treaty of bullshit, and then I can follow, join, learn, contribute to those conversations. And same with Facebook as well, is that it has a very good search functions.
Thanks, Ian.
Fanny?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Professor Ian, for your really wonderful presentation. A lot of useful information there. My question is around those multimedia tools provided by some of the journals. So in OB and management discipline, I know that some journals would allow or encourage authors to produce a maybe short video to summarize the key findings of their papers and then upload it to the journal's webpage. So I just wonder, how do you see the utility of these journal linked platform versus our own personal social media platforms? Have you have experiences using those tools and platform provided by journal? How do you, if so, do you find it useful in comparison to promoting your idea and work on your personal Twitter or LinkedIn account?
Great question. I haven't had any personal experience. I come close with California Management Review, but my paper wasn't accepted. I think it depends on the journal, and I think it depends on the resources of the journal and the publisher. And so Harvard Business Review, California Management Review, they do a reasonable job of actually producing sort of explainer videos. The Academy of Management is increasingly doing it as well, and they're producing explainer videos. And it's quite interesting is that they're catching up. They're catching up to what sort of individual academics are doing, and in some cases, it's better, and in some cases it's not. So I really do think it depends on the resources and skills, and in many cases it's not necessarily the quality of the video. It's the script and it's the story that you're going to tell in 2 minutes. So it's not necessarily, what the special effects are in the video or the quality of the animation in terms of doing things, is do you have an interesting story to share, to the people you want to share it with, and can it be distilled in 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes or a collection of short videos? That's more important than the technology itself. I think the technology is going to get easier and easier, and the hard thing is going to be, I often find sometimes that I do a piece of research, and then when I want to, and when I want to share it, I actually find that it's not that interesting. I think, I've written this research, it's got into a good journal, it may be getting well cited, but when I try and think about the takeaways, they're obvious, or they're boring, or they're difficult to actually tell nice stories around. And that's a really good sort of post research exercise when you've suddenly spent 4 or 5 years working on something that you're quite proud of. It's technically sound, it's theoretically quite interesting, but it doesn't really seem to have much value in terms of, and so to what extent would you share the videos or the papers or the blog posts in an MBA class? That's my test. And so not all of my papers get the dissemination treatment. Many of my papers get the framing, networking, investigating treatment, but not all of them get the full disseminating treatment because they're just not interesting enough.
That's a good point, and maybe we should be thinking about what tweet would we send out before we actually commence some research to see, sort of how influential or interesting people would find it. Normal people outside academia.
You're sending a tweet which is just sort of saying, yeah, I got into a paper. That's like a celebration announcement. But if you want to say, this is the nugget of information, and this is what you should really think about. And when you start thinking, is that really interesting? Like, in terms of are these takeaways? Are these learning points? Are these observations? So that I wouldn't say don't limit yourself on celebrating and telling the world that you publish stuff, but the next level is what are the sharing points and what are the things that you want people to know and think about and think and act differently.
Great, thank you. Well, we've gone a bit over time, so thank you very much for staying back to answer the questions, and thanks for everyone for staying on, even though it's a bit over time, but thank you very much. And we will send around the recording, and so thank you again, Ian, for your time and for all this given us a lot to think about, and it's really good to have got your expert insights into this, and you're clearly doing so well in this area. So thank you very much for sharing all your experience and expertise with us.
My pleasure. And if you want the slides, I'll send you the slides or a link to the slides. And
Oh, wonderful.
any questions, feel free to get in touch. And thank you for the opportunity. So Deakin was the first part of this dissemination campaign that's going to follow for a few months now, and so thank you.
Oh, thank you for the honor for making us the first part of your dissemination strategy. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day. All right,
Thanks,
bye.
Ian.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Then